In 1944, at a prisoner of war camp in the Arizona desert, an unlikely romance blooms between Eleanor Powell, a Black Army nurse, and Frederick Albert, a German POW baker. Their secret love affair defies not only military regulations, but the racial prejudices of wartime America. As they exchange hidden notes in multiple languages and risk court-martial for stolen moments together, Eleanor and Frederick must navigate a world where their relationship challenges every social boundary of the era. Based on the true story that preceded the landmark Loving versus Virginia case by 20 years, this is a tale of love conquering hate in the most unexpected circumstances. In the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, where mirages danced on the horizon and the sun beat down mercilessly, Camp Florence stood as a testament to the harsh realities of war. The year was 1944, and America was deep in the throes of World War II. Behind the barbed wire and watchtowers of this prisoner of war camp, hundreds of German and Italian soldiers lived in captivity, their dreams of homeland reduced to memories that grew fainter with each passing day. The camp itself was a study in contrasts, military precision imposed upon the chaotic landscape of human suffering. Neat rows of barracks stretched across the desert floor, while armed guards patrolled the perimeter with clockwork regularity. The American flag snapped in the dry wind, a constant reminder of who held power in this isolated corner of the world. But Camp Florence reflected more than just the division between captor and captive. It mirrored the deep racial segregation that permeated every aspect of American society, even within its own military ranks. Black soldiers and nurses served their country with unwavering dedication, yet they remained second-class citizens, relegated to separate quarters, separate mess halls, and often the most undesirable assignments. Eleanor Powell understood this reality better than most. At 24, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect, even from those who would deny her basic human rights. Her crisp white nurse's uniform was always immaculate, her dark hair pinned back with military precision, and her intelligent brown eyes missed nothing. She had chosen nursing as her path to serve, believing that healing knew no color. Yet even in service to her country, she found herself assigned to duties that white nurses considered beneath them, caring for enemy prisoners of war. Eleanor's journey to Camp Florence had been paved with small victories and large disappointments. Born in Alabama to parents who had instilled in her the belief that education and hard work could overcome any obstacle, she had excelled in her nursing studies despite the constant reminders of her place in society. The Army had offered her an opportunity to serve, but even in uniform, she faced the same prejudices that had followed her throughout her life. Her quarters at Camp Florence were in the segregated section of the base, a constant reminder that even those who served their country were not considered equal. Yet Eleanor approached her duties with unwavering professionalism. She had learned early that excellence was her shield against those who would diminish her, and she wielded that shield with quiet determination. On the other side of the camp's rigid hierarchy stood Frederick Albert, a young man whose world had been turned upside down by the machinery of war. At 22, the Bavarian baker had been transformed from a civilian craftsman into a German soldier, and then into a prisoner of war in a land so foreign it might as well have been another planet. Frederick's journey to Camp Florence had been a series of devastating losses. Captured during the Allied advance through Italy, he had watched his homeland disappear behind him as he was transported across an ocean to this desert prison. The man who had once taken pride in creating beautiful pastries and bread for his community now found himself reduced to a number, a uniform, and a daily routine of labor and confinement. In the camp bakery where he was assigned to work, Frederick performed his duties with mechanical precision. The familiar motions of kneading dough and tending ovens provided some comfort, a connection to the life he had lost. Yet the bread he baked now fed his captors and fellow prisoners alike, a daily reminder of his powerless state. What struck Frederick most about his new environment was the peculiar nature of American segregation. In Germany, he had witnessed the horrific persecution of Jews and other minorities, but the American system of racial division was different, more subtle perhaps, but no less pervasive. He observed how Black American soldiers and staff were treated by their white counterparts, noting the invisible barriers that seemed to separate people who wore the same uniform and served the same flag. The first time Eleanor entered the bakery, Frederick was arranging loaves of bread on wooden shelves. The routine task had become so automatic that he barely looked up when the door opened. But something made him glance toward the entrance, and in that moment, his world shifted on its axis. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her medical bag in hand, there to collect supplies for the infirmary. She moved with purpose and grace, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. When their eyes met across the flour-dusted workspace, something electric passed between them, a recognition that transcended nationality, race, and circumstance. For Frederick, it was as if he was seeing clearly for the first time since his capture. Here was a woman who radiated strength and intelligence, whose very presence seemed to illuminate the sterile environment around her. The moment stretched between them, neither speaking, both acutely aware that something significant had just occurred. Eleanor felt the impact of that gaze like a physical force. In Frederick's blue eyes, she saw not the enemy she had been trained to regard with suspicion, but a human being whose humanity called to her own. It was a dangerous recognition, one that challenged everything she had been taught about duty, loyalty, and the clear lines that were supposed to separate friend from foe. The spell was broken when another prisoner entered the bakery, and Eleanor quickly gathered the supplies she needed and departed. But the image of Frederick's face remained with her long after she had left, and she found herself thinking about that moment of connection throughout the rest of her shift. For Frederick, Eleanor's brief presence had awakened something he thought had died during his long months of captivity. Hope. Not hope for freedom or return to Germany, but hope for human connection, for the possibility that even in this place of confinement and division, two souls might recognize each other across the barriers that others had constructed. Days passed before they encountered each other again, but when they did, the recognition was immediate and mutual. This time, Frederick was prepared. As Eleanor collected medical supplies, he approached her with a small piece of paper, folded and carefully concealed in his palm. "For your kindness," he said in halting English, his accent thick, but his meaning clear. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before accepting the note. The risk was enormous. Fraternization between staff and prisoners was strictly forbidden, and for a black nurse to be caught in any kind of personal interaction with a German POW could mean the end of her career, and possibly much worse. But something in Frederick's eyes, a sincerity and gentleness that seemed impossible in this harsh environment, compelled her to take the risk. She slipped the note into her pocket and continued with her duties, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. That evening, alone in her quarters, Eleanor unfolded the small piece of paper. Written in careful English, with several words crossed out and rewritten, was a simple message. "Thank you for seeing me as a person. Your kindness gives me hope. F.A." The note was innocent enough, but Eleanor understood its deeper significance. In a world that had reduced both of them to categories, enemy, prisoner, black nurse, Frederick was reaching out to her as one human being to another. It was an act of courage that both terrified and moved her. Eleanor spent the next several days debating whether to respond. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about the dangers of such contact. Yet she found herself drawn to the simple humanity of Frederick's gesture, to the possibility of connection in a place designed to keep people apart. Finally, she crafted her own note, written on a small piece of medical paper. "Your words touched my heart. In this place of division, it is rare to find someone who sees beyond uniforms and skin color. E.P." The exchange of this second note required careful planning. Eleanor waited until her next supply run to the bakery, timing her arrival for a moment when Frederick was alone. The handoff was swift and subtle, but the impact was profound for both of them. Thus began a correspondence that would span months and transform both their lives. Their notes became more frequent and more personal, passed through increasingly creative methods. Frederick would hide messages in bread loaves destined for the infirmary, while Eleanor would slip her responses into supply requisitions or medical reports that passed through the bakery. Their written conversations revealed the depth of their compatibility. Frederick wrote about his life in Bavaria, his family's bakery, his dreams of returning to a peaceful world where he could create beautiful things again. Eleanor shared her experiences growing up in the segregated South, her determination to prove herself, in a profession that barely tolerated her presence, her hopes for a future where her worth would be measured by her character rather than her color. The language barrier became both an obstacle and a bridge. Frederick's English improved rapidly through their correspondence, while Eleanor found herself learning German phrases and remembering her high school French. They created their own linguistic blend, mixing languages with an intimacy that made their communication feel like a secret code known only to them. As winter gave way to spring in 1945, their relationship deepened beyond mere correspondence. The emotional connection they had forged through words demanded physical expression, and both Eleanor and Frederick found themselves taking increasingly dangerous risks to be together. Their first real conversation took place in a storage room behind the bakery, during a brief window when the guards were changing shifts. Standing face to face, speaking in whispers, they confirmed what their letters had already revealed, that despite every barrier society had placed between them, they had fallen deeply in love. "I never believed I could feel this way about someone," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. Frederick reached out tentatively, his fingers barely brushing her hand. "In Germany, I thought I understood love, but this is something I never imagined possible." Their meetings became more frequent, always carefully planned and executed with military precision. They would find moments in supply closets, empty corridors, and shadowed corners of the camp. Each encounter was fraught with danger, but also filled with a tenderness that seemed to defy the harsh realities of their environment. The physical expression of their love was inevitable, a natural progression of the deep emotional bond they had forged. In stolen moments of intimacy, they found solace and connection that transcended the barriers of war, race, and circumstance. Their love became an act of rebellion against a world that insisted they were enemies, that demanded they remain forever separated by the artificial divisions others had created. But their secret could not remain hidden forever. In late spring of 1945, Eleanor made a discovery that would change everything. She was pregnant. The news hit her like a physical blow. Sitting alone in her quarters, staring at the evidence of her condition, Eleanor felt the weight of her situation crash down upon her. A black woman, unmarried, pregnant by a German prisoner of war. It was a scenario that could destroy not only her career, but her entire future. The social implications were staggering. In 1945 America, an unmarried black mother faced enormous challenges even under the best circumstances. But to be carrying the child of an enemy soldier would make her a pariah, subject to both racial prejudice and accusations of treason. She could lose her nursing license, face court-martial, and find herself completely ostracized from society. When Eleanor shared the news with Frederick during one of their clandestine meetings, she saw her own fear and desperation reflected in his eyes. As a prisoner of war, he was powerless to protect her or provide for their child. The realization of their helplessness was crushing, but Frederick's response surprised her. After the initial shock wore off, he took her hands in his and spoke with quiet determination. "This child is a gift, Eleanor, a symbol of love conquering hate. We will find a way." It was Frederick who proposed the desperate plan that would define the next phase of their relationship. He had learned that prisoners of war, who fathered children with American citizens, sometimes received preferential treatment in repatriation proceedings. If they could prove that he had family ties to the United States, it might expedite his return as a civilian rather than a repatriated prisoner. The plan was audacious and risky, to deliberately conceive a second child, strengthening Frederick's claim to American family connections. It meant Eleanor would face the challenges of 2 pregnancies while maintaining her military duties and keeping their relationship secret. But it also represented their only hope of building a life together. "Are you certain about this?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision. Frederick's response was immediate and unwavering. "I would rather risk everything for a chance at a life with you than accept the certainty of a life without you." Their decision to proceed with this plan was perhaps the most courageous act of their entire relationship. They were gambling their futures on the slim possibility that love could overcome the massive obstacles arrayed against them. As 1945 progressed and the war in Europe drew to a close, the atmosphere at Camp Florence began to change. Prisoners were being processed for repatriation, and Frederick received word that he would be among those returning to Germany. The news was bittersweet. While it meant freedom from captivity, it also meant separation from Eleanor at the most critical time in their relationship. Their final weeks together were filled with desperate planning and tearful preparations. Frederick made Eleanor promise to write to him through a contact in Germany, a cousin who could serve as an intermediary. He also gave her what little money he had managed to save from his prison wages, knowing it would barely help but wanting to contribute something to their children's welfare. The day of Frederick's departure was one of the most difficult of Eleanor's life. They managed one final brief meeting in the early morning hours before the transport arrived. Standing in the shadows behind the bakery where their love had first bloomed, they held each other with the desperate intensity of people who might never meet again. "I will come back for you," Frederick whispered against her hair. "No matter what it takes, no matter how long it takes, I will find a way back to you and our children." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but the practical part of her mind catalogued all the obstacles that stood in their way. Immigration laws, racial prejudices, economic hardships, and the simple logistics of crossing an ocean with no resources. Any one of these challenges could prove insurmountable. But as she watched the transport truck disappear into the desert morning, carrying Frederick away from her, Eleanor made her own vow. She would survive whatever came next. She would protect their children and keep their love alive, no matter what society threw at her. The months that followed Frederick's departure were the most challenging of Eleanor's life. Hiding her pregnancy while continuing her nursing duties required enormous physical and emotional strength. As her condition became more apparent, she faced increasingly suspicious looks from her colleagues and superiors. Eventually, Eleanor was forced to leave the army, her military career ending under circumstances she could never fully explain. She returned to civilian life carrying the secret of her relationship and the growing evidence of her love for Frederick. Finding work as a pregnant, unmarried black woman in 1945, America was nearly impossible. Eleanor took whatever jobs she could find, cleaning houses, working in laundries, anything that would provide enough income to survive. The physical demands of these jobs while pregnant were exhausting, but Eleanor endured them with the same quiet determination that had carried her through nursing school. The birth of their first child was both a moment of joy and a reminder of her isolation. Holding her baby for the first time, Eleanor saw Frederick's eyes looking back at her, and she felt both overwhelming love and crushing loneliness. This beautiful child was the product of a love that society refused to acknowledge, and Eleanor knew she would have to be both mother and father in a world that would judge them harshly. Throughout this difficult period, Eleanor maintained contact with Frederick through carefully worded letters sent to his cousin in Germany. These messages were her lifeline, the only connection to the man she loved, and the hope that their separation might someday end. Frederick's letters painted a picture of a Germany devastated by war. He had returned to find his family's bakery destroyed, his hometown barely recognizable. But despite the hardships he faced, every letter reaffirmed his commitment to returning to Eleanor and their children. "I work every day toward the moment when I can hold you again," he wrote in one letter. "The Germany I knew is gone, but the love we share remains stronger than ever. I am learning English better, saving every penny, and exploring every possible way to return to America." The birth of their second child in early 1946 brought both joy and increased hardship. Eleanor now had 2 young children to support on her meager income, and the challenges of single motherhood in a prejudiced society seemed overwhelming at times. But the second child also represented hope. Frederick's plan had been based on the theory that multiple American-born children would strengthen his case for immigration to the United States. Eleanor began researching immigration laws and procedures, determined to understand every possible avenue for Frederick's return. The breakthrough came in late 1946, when Frederick's letters began to mention meetings with American immigration officials. The process was complex and expensive, requiring sponsors, documentation, and proof of his relationship to American citizens, his children. But slowly, painstakingly, the bureaucratic machinery began to turn in their favor. Eleanor used this time to prepare for Frederick's return. She found work in New York, where she had learned that interracial marriage was legal. The move was difficult with 2 small children, But Eleanor knew that building a life together would require them to be in a state where their union could be legally recognized. The telegram arrived on a cold February morning in 1947. Arriving New York, March 15th. Can hardly believe this day has come. All my love, Frederick. Eleanor read the message 3 times before the reality sank in. After nearly 2 years of separation, countless obstacles and moments when hope seemed impossible to maintain, Frederick was coming home to her. The reunion at the dock in New York was everything Eleanor had dreamed and more. She stood in the crowd of people waiting for the ship to arrive, her 2 children in her arms, scanning the faces of the passengers as they disembarked. When she finally saw Frederick walking down the gangplank, older and thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably the man she loved, she felt as if her heart might burst. Their embrace, witnessed by hundreds of strangers who had no idea of the journey that had brought them to this moment, was a triumph of love over every force that had tried to keep them apart. Frederick held Eleanor and met his children for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he realized that his impossible dream had become reality. "I told you I would come back," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I never stopped believing," Eleanor replied, and in that moment all the hardships of the past 2 years seemed like a small price to pay for this reunion. But their challenges were far from over. Even in New York, an interracial couple in 1947 faced enormous social pressures. Finding housing was difficult, as many landlords refused to rent to mixed-race families. Employment opportunities were limited for both of them, Frederick because of his status as a former enemy prisoner, Eleanor because of the racial prejudices that followed her everywhere. Yet they persevered, building a life together one small victory at a time. Frederick found work in a bakery, his skills as a craftsman helping him establish himself in his new country. Eleanor returned to nursing, her experience and competence eventually overcoming the initial reluctance of employers to hire her. Their wedding, held in a small ceremony in New York in late 1947, was a quiet but profound statement of defiance against a society that insisted their love was impossible. The simple exchange of vows represented a victory not just for them personally, but for the principle that love could indeed conquer the artificial barriers that others sought to impose. Standing before the justice of the peace, Eleanor and Frederick were acutely aware of the historical significance of their union. Their marriage took place 20 years before the Supreme Court would rule in Loving v. Virginia that laws prohibiting interracial marriage were unconstitutional. They were pioneers, whether they intended to be or not, proving that love could exist and thrive across racial lines, even in the most hostile environments. The years that followed were not easy, but they were filled with the quiet satisfaction of a love that had survived every test. Frederick adapted to American life, with the same determination he had shown in winning Eleanor's heart. He learned the language, the customs, and the complex racial dynamics of his new country, always supporting Eleanor as she navigated the dual challenges of being both black and part of an interracial marriage. Their children grew up in a household where love was the defining principle, where the artificial divisions of race and nationality were revealed as the arbitrary constructions they truly were. Eleanor and Frederick taught their children to be proud of their heritage, both African American and German, and to understand that their very existence was a testament to the power of love to overcome hate. The broader civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s would eventually catch up to the quiet revolution that Eleanor and Frederick had begun in their own lives. When the Loving v. Virginia decision was handed down in 1967, striking down laws against interracial marriage, Eleanor and Frederick watched the news with the satisfaction of people who had been fighting that battle for 20 years. Their story became a quiet inspiration to others who faced similar challenges. Word of their love affair spread through networks of people who understood the courage it had taken to build a life together against such overwhelming odds. They received letters from other interracial couples, from civil rights activists, and from people who simply wanted to express their admiration for what Eleanor and Frederick had accomplished. But perhaps the greatest testament to their love was the simple fact of their enduring happiness. Decades after their first meeting in that prison camp bakery, Eleanor and Frederick remained devoted to each other with the same intensity that had first brought them together. Their love had not only survived the tests of war, racism, and separation, It had grown stronger through each challenge. Looking back on their journey, Eleanor and Frederick understood that their love story was about more than just two people finding each other. It was about the fundamental human capacity to see beyond the artificial divisions that society creates, to recognize the shared humanity that connects all people regardless of race, nationality, or circumstance. Their relationship had begun in a place designed to emphasize differences between captor and captive, between races, between nations at war. But love had revealed these divisions to be illusions, temporary constructions that could not withstand the power of genuine human connection. In the end, Eleanor Powell and Frederick Albert had done something that seemed impossible in 1944. They had refused to let racism win. Their love had triumphed over prejudice, their commitment had overcome separation, and their courage had created a family that stood as living proof that the barriers between people are never as strong as the bonds that can unite them. Their story serves as a reminder that love, when it is genuine and determined, can indeed conquer hate. In a world that often seems divided by forces beyond individual control, Eleanor and Frederick proved that two people, armed with nothing more than love and courage, can change the world, at least their corner of it. The legacy of their love extends far beyond their own lives. Their children and grandchildren carry forward the lesson that love knows no boundaries, that human worth is not determined by race or nationality, and that the courage to love across artificial divisions can create ripples that extend far into the future. Eleanor and Frederick's story is ultimately one of hope. Hope that love can survive in the most hostile environments. Hope that individuals can triumph over systemic oppression. And hope that the human capacity for connection is stronger than any force that seeks to divide us. They didn't let racism win because they understood something that their society had forgotten, that love, when it is true and brave and persistent, is the most powerful force in the human experience. Their quiet revolution, begun in a prison camp in the Arizona desert, continues to inspire all who believe that love can indeed conquer hate. If this incredible love story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that prove love conquers all. Hit that like button if Eleanor and Frederick's courage inspired you, and leave a comment below telling us what you think about their remarkable journey.